Hello and welcome to The Briefing, a weekly conversation with leaders and experts to explore the ideas shaping our democracy today. I'm Michael Waldman. I'm the president and CEO of the Brennan Center. Thank you all for joining us. We're having this conversation at a time when the government is shut down, the most visible manifestation of the deep fights over spending and the power over spending. The questions of the power of the purse, the questions of who has control over the spending in the government is not just about dollars. And it's not only about the impact that it has on people. It's about power. It's about the structure of the Constitution. It's about who really gets to have the say under our constitutional order. Now, presidents have wanted to control that, to have the ability as much as possible to control spending. And the Constitution gives Congress the preeminent role. And Congress has tried intermittently at times to keep its role preeminent. How should this happen? What's different now? What is this administration under Donald Trump doing as part of its thrust for executive power to try to take control over the government and try to take control over spending? And is it doing it illegally? Is it doing it in violation of the Constitution? And what can be done about it? It's a very big question that we're going to be hearing about this year. It's in front of the Supreme Court. It affects all of our lives, of course. And I think it's really important as we live through this constitutional challenge, if not constitutional crisis, that we all understand what's going on. We have two experts from different dimensions. I'm joined here by Lauren Miller Karalunas, who is a counsel at the Brennan Center and leads a lot of our work in the courts on these issues of presidential power and spending and the power of the purse. And we are really fortunate to be joined by Shalanda Young. She has extraordinary background to bring to this conversation. She was director of the Office of Management and Budget from 2021 to 2025. That is, of course, the cabinet agency that deals with spending and the operations of the government and the budget and so many other things. She was also the staff director, after 15 years on the staff, of the House Appropriations Committee. And in other words, she has been a leading policymaker and an expert at both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue on these questions. And she is now at NYU School of Law as a visiting fellow and scholar. And we are grateful to have you here, Shalanda, and grateful to you as well, Lauren. And Shalanda, if I could just start with you, I think your perspective is really unique in having this view from both ends of the avenue and in a way holistically. What would you say you learned from all your experiences about how this question of spending and budgets and power over spending really unfolds? Not just on paper, not just abstractly, but like in terms of the people.
Obviously, I put a lot of thought into this, is what I spent my career on. And what is clear to me, and I don't think this is limited to the power of the purse and spending, this push and pull between the executive and the legislative branch. You see it in tariffs, you see it in war powers, and the things I understood the balance to be are being tested in ways I never contemplated. And we're all struggling with where does the law start and end, and where did the norms in which this very complex system of government we have, where the norms really kept us on track. And as I think about it, the one big lesson I have is norms only work if both sides agree to those norms, and they provide checks for both sides. And we can cry about those norms now finding their way into oblivion, or we can deal with the new normal and figure out how to operate. And where I come out on both sides of Pennsylvania Avenue is Congress has got to find the will and the motivation to take its constitutional power back. And if norms are going to be violated, what does Congress need to do in putting the institution before partisan concerns? So I spent a lot of time thinking about that. Obviously, if I'm coming from that direction, I believe, in our current system that too much power has been given to the executive. Congress, in its infinite wisdom, has always gave the executive branch flexibility. Things come up through the year that Congress didn't know would happen, and the executive branch must have flexibility, Michael. But nothing like what we're seeing now was ever contemplated. And if the executive is going to abuse that power that I believe Congress gives it in flexibility, Congress needs to take it back.
That's really interesting. And we have these conversations week after week about the role of the Supreme Court, about all these other things. And so often, these other institutions have the chance, at least, to try to grab power because Congress has not stepped up to do its role as we wanted to, as assigned. And as you know, of course, one of the goals is how do you get Congress to think and act as a coordinate branch of government and not just as a branch of a political party. The appropriations process was always the most bipartisan of activities in the Congress. The chairs of the subcommittees were called the cardinals, and it was something that even when there was so much polarization, Congress was still flexing its muscles and acting like Congress. Did you when you went over to OMB, were you surprised under President Biden, obviously a very different president, were you surprised by things you came to believe about presidential authority that were different than what you thought when you were doing the work on Capitol Hill?
So, we started this conversation with these things didn't just happen now. This administration is operating on a different scale. They'll push in limits like we've never seen. But uh, you know, presidents push the envelope in order, to maneuver, especially when Congress hasn't passed legislation that arises to the moment when there's a national problem happening and there is no response from Congress. Presidents are expected by the American people to answer those. So that, having worked for one president and seeing others operate, I think we've seen a trend as Congress has atrophied. It's like chicken or egg. Congress atrophied, and you see an executive branch presidencies start to gobble more power. You see that in the number of executive orders that have ticked up. You see it in power of the purses, where any flexibility presidents try to use that flexibility to answer hard questions. I think I think a lot about these issues. There has to be a tipping point where Congress, again, as you pointed out, doesn't act with its partisan nature as its primal function, but it has to probably be offended enough about something that happens in the executive branch to come together, and both parties answer that by pushing back in a unified way. It could be tariffs, it could be power of the purse. Uh, we haven't seen where that moment is with this administration, but it's also year one. But I believe there's still a chance, and that's the optimist in me.
And this administration, uh, I believe, but I believe that you have said as well, is really pushing things far beyond what other recent administrations have done. We've seen from the start, and your successor, Russell Vought, has been one of the driving forces behind the policy all throughout the administration. There have been efforts made, and in fact, successful, I guess if you want to call it that, efforts to effectively dismantle agencies like USAID, the launching of the dismantling through funding and personnel cuts of the Department of Education, 1,800 NIH grants terminated, $7.6 billion in funding for energy projects in blue states, and much, much more. There's a wide array of things where either funding has been blocked or cut or turned off, where people have been fired as a way, in effect, of cutting the spending and cutting the activity, or even changing the organization chart. Do you agree that this is beyond anything we've seen, at least since the Nixon administration, or is it even beyond that?
Oh, it's so far beyond Nixon, and frankly, Congress stepped up and they passed the Impoundment and Control Act. And people look at that act as if it says don't impound. Well, the Constitution covers that. The Constitution endows Congress with its power to tax and spend. The Impoundment Act simply gave the executive branch a process in which to deal with funding if they would like to rescind or defer spending. But Congress didn't need that act to say, "Hey, we are the Article 1 power is vested in us to tax and spend." But they felt, given Nixon's pushing of those boundaries, that they needed to pass something else to, frankly, compartmentalize him even more by setting up these processes. And this White House makes Nixon look mild by comparison. Um, there is constant impoundment. The problem is the shock and awe is real. There are pots of money. No one can tell you where it is in the policy review process. And GAO, the Government Accountability Office, who has been given the authority by Congress itself to opine on when the executive branch is overstepping and impounding funds Congress said you are to spend on X, Y, and Z. You know what this administration has done? They've gone out of their way to try to convince the American people and congressional Republicans GAO is bad and they're bad at their job. No one should ever listen to them. It's because they know that GAO is going to side against them and that they're violating the Impoundment and Control Act. What I have not been able to wrap my brain around is why congressional Republicans would side with the executive branch on that argument and not stand up for GAO, the Congressional Budget Office, Library of Congress, these institutions they set up to help them do their job. They're critical. Congress is incredibly small compared to the executive branch. You even wonder how they can keep up with everything in the executive branch. But one reason they can, kind of, is through these agencies they set up like GAO, who help them police and monitor the executive branch. And this Office of Management and Budget, this White House has gone out of their way not to just pull power from Congress, not to just impound funds, but to really go and do systematic damage to the reputation of these critical ancillary agencies that Congress has relied on for decades to be the nonpartisan, really, arbiters of facts. So now we're saying these fact-based agencies should not be listened to. That's going to have generational consequences for Congresses, no matter who they're run by, if we allow this tearing down of congressional infrastructure. It's bad. If we let this continue, it's going to be worse.
And I think people don't realize the Library of Congress is not just that magnificent building with all the books, but it's also the Congressional Research Service, which provides really objective and kind of bulletproof assessments of issues, of what's legal, of what the law says, and that sort of thing that's widely used not only in Congress, but outside. And
Michael, do you know who the head of the Library of Congress is now?
Tell us.
I mean, I think the number 2 at DOJ.
Because the president claimed the right to push out the leader of the Library of Congress,
who was picked by bipartisan members of Congress to run an institution with their name in it. The Library of Congress is Congress's crown jewel. It is a beautiful building. It does provide resources to researchers around this country. It is the copyright home of this country, and it didn't have a political bone in its history. And those are the kind of small things that are small on paper, but Congress allowing the executive branch to come in and fundamentally change their institutions. I don't want to overstate, but I can't understate it either. It's something I never thought I'd see in my lifetime. I think it's going to have generational consequences. And because you are connected by party to this one president, you should not take your eye off the prize for what this is doing to the institution and its inability to function and stand up to an executive branch, no matter who sits in the White House.
And it really is one of the things that historians and political scientists will be baffled by. An institution with so much power and so much latent power, just giving it up. You've seen this more in the area of war making and somewhat in foreign policy over the years, especially during the Cold War. But in the core basic functioning of the government, the core basic spending decisions and other things like that, that it has been seeded in this way without even a fight is really quite extraordinary. And soon the president, under the law, will be in a position to nominate, I guess, a new head of GAO who will be in an actual operational function of making some rulings in effect on impoundment. You mentioned Nixon, and I think people who watch this show every week, or whatever we're calling it, a podcast, and people who I work with know that sooner or later Nixon comes up, and I'm always very excited when we can talk about Nixon. Impoundment was a big issue when he was president. It was actually something they considered including in impeachment, although they did not. And Congress did respond with the Impoundment Control Act of 1974. Now, Nixon said he had an absolute right to impound funds. This is what Donald Trump, as an ex-president and a soon-to-be candidate for that office again, said in 2023. He said, talking about the Impoundment Control Act of 1974, this disaster of a law is clearly unconstitutional, a blatant violation of the separation of powers. I don't know if he wrote this, but this is what he said. Bringing back impoundment will give us a crucial tool with which to obliterate the deep state, drain the swamp, and starve the warmongers.
Now, what year was that said?
2023. Our Brennan Center Research Service tells me he has been primed to claim this power, and as you said, it doesn't stop presidents from changing decisions about how funding is done or moving things around, but it creates a process and gives Congress a role and the ability to say, no, that's not a technical change. We don't want you to do this. And I think that's quite important. This is one of the issues, and I'm going to bring Lauren into this conversation, that is being litigated right now in the courts in such a big way. There are about 150 cases that have been brought before courts about impoundment, about rescissions, which is one of the other technical terms, about shutting down spending, shutting down agencies, and that sort of thing. About 60 or so of the cases actually stopped or stalled or froze what the administration was trying to do. Can you give us the broad lay of the land of what the courts are being pulled in to do? This is not something they're usually ever comfortable doing, but right now they've really been pulled in because Congress has not stepped up to its role. What's happening, and what are some of the cases we should know about?
That's exactly right. So because Congress has not stepped up, or at least the majority in Congress has not stepped up, we're seeing just countless lawsuits. There's about 500 cases at this point against the administration in total. And to your point, Michael, 150 of those are funding related in some respects. So in terms of the cases that we're seeing, the claims range a broad spectrum. As we've been discussing, there's the claims over the power of the purse, the fact that Congress enacts laws, not the president. Once Congress approves a budget and passes those spending laws, it is the president's and the executive branch's duty generally to carry those laws out. So we're seeing some claims over separation of powers, the spending clause in the Constitution, and the appropriations clause, for example, as well. We're also seeing claims related to the fact that what the administration is doing is violating the actual language of those spending bills that Congress has passed. In other words,
not just the Constitution and its broad structure of the government, but specific statutory text that really you have to follow.
Exactly. And we're also seeing claims related to something called the Administrative Procedure Act, which governs how agencies under the executive branch are supposed to operate. and the fact that the administration is not following those when it is doing these broad strokes actions. So we're seeing a lot of different claims. And to your point, the lower courts have really been responding because these cases are still very much in flux. Litigation takes a long time. When they actually have the chance to hear these cases on the merits, so after full briefing and oral argument, they are really, for the most part, deciding in favor of the plaintiffs bringing these cases.
So even though courts usually kind of get the hives when they're asked to get in between a fight, in effect, between the one branch and another, the executive and Congress, in this case, they've actually stepped up. It's been, in a sense, the reaction of these trial courts has been a pleasant surprise, I would say, in this administration. Are these just Democratic appointed judges?
That's absolutely right. They have really stepped up, and these are judges from across administrations appointed by Republican presidents, including President Trump himself in the first administration, and Democratic presidents, so across the political spectrum.
But it's pretty unusual, right? Now, is that because what the Trump administration is doing is so unusual, or are the judges sort of discerning a pattern here that they want to blow the whistle on?
I think it is in part for both of those things. The administration is doing things that are so unprecedented and so blatantly unlawful. I think at this point, the latest tally is that as of early September, the administration had withheld or canceled or fought to block or otherwise delay almost $410 billion in money owed to the American people. So essentially money stolen from the American public.
These are grants or other kinds of benefits that people are supposed to get.
Exactly. So courts have recognized this. And to your point, they are discerning a pattern that this is happening time and time again. And they have also started to realize that sometimes what the government is telling them in this litigation, the lawyers themselves, are not always being truthful for whatever reason. Maybe it's a miscommunication. We've seen cases where the courts have ordered the administration to spend money, to halt their pauses on money, and the administration has not done so. And courts are starting to recognize this pattern, and they're creating stricter and stricter orders, and they're really demanding more and more compliance from the administration.
So the administration is saying, oh, no, we're following these court orders, but actually they're not really.
Correct.
So, we've said that this issue of presidential power, this extraordinary power grab, is the great constitutional issue of this era. There are other times when it's individual rights or state rights versus the federal, but really it's here, we're seeing an aggrandizement by this president, by the executive, again, to tilt the whole way the government works. And the good news has been that so many of these trial courts have made these rulings. Mm-hmm. Of course, that's not the end of the story. So many of these cases have gone up to appeals courts, or especially the Supreme Court has gotten involved. And the Supreme Court has sort of reached into the workings of the federal courts to undo what a lot of these trial courts have done and allow these cuts to take effect. This is what is kind of scarily known as the shadow docket, but where they make big rulings or big actions without hearing a full case. How do you see the kind of difference between how the trial courts are handling this, and how has the Supreme Court in particular handled this so far this year?
Sure. And so you said something that makes a lot of sense, which is the trial courts have recognized this power grab. And I think it's important to note, too, that the trial courts have really acknowledged that there is a reason the framers themselves set up the Constitution this way. The framers had seen from the monarchy that they revolted against that one person should not be in control of the power of the purse and the power of the sword. So the president is already the commander-in-chief. And so the lower courts have recognized...
That's a line from Alexander Hamilton.
Exactly, yes.
Not in rap, but in real life.
Yes, in real life and in rap, perhaps. And they have recognized that the president should not have this power of the purse and the power of the sword at the same time. Lower courts have recognized this, but what has happened as these cases have gone up, not on full appeals yet, because a lot of these rulings that are being appealed are emergency and temporary rulings, the Supreme Court has gotten these cases on what's known as their shadow or emergency docket, where they don't have to give, according to their terms, a full explanation of why they're doing what they're doing. They're not hearing full oral argument. They're not getting issues fully briefed. And in those cases, The administration has been very savvy in building up a lot of technical wins that is making it much easier for the executive to seize this power. And even if, 1-2 years down the line, these cases finally reach the court on the merits, and the court sides with the plaintiffs and says the president cannot refuse to spend money or cancel money in this way, the damage will have already been done.
It's like tearing down the East Wing and then releasing the pictures of what's going to replace it, basically.
Exactly.
So on this shadow docket, and the justices, especially, I believe it was Justice Alito, they hate it when it's called the shadow docket. He said it was a slur or something like that, but it was actually another name for this emergency docket. But what we've seen is the administration going to the Supreme Court, asking for it to undo what these trial courts have done. And on these and other cases, our estimate is about 85% of the time the administration has won. But now it's October, and so the regular Supreme Court term has started, and a lot of the cases that we know are the really big presidential power cases are about, can a president fire the head of an independent agency or the members of an independent agency, Fed Governor Lisa Cook? Can a president unilaterally set worldwide tariffs? That's the big case that is really going to be a significant one that's going to be heard very shortly. But there are these other cases coming up as well. Will these questions of the power of the purse be the substance of any of the really big cases, do you think, coming up this term at the Supreme Court?
Well, it's still a little early to tell since we are so early in the term which of the cases exactly will go up. But I think we will see the Supreme Court being confronted with a few questions it finally has to answer. One of which is, can the president do a universal, across the country, temporary freeze of all federal financial assistance, as it tried to do? I think we'll see the court being forced to answer whether the administration can place conditions on grant money that's already been awarded to recipients to convince them or coerce them into following the president's personal policy preferences, even if they have nothing to do with what those grants were intended to actually enable. I think we'll see the court have to give a fulsome explanation as to how and when recipients of grants that have been mass terminated, how they can challenge the termination
What their rights
of those
are.
grants.
Right.
Exactly. And we'll see pocket rescissions likely come back before the Supreme Court at some point as well. So it's going to be a full plate when those cases reach them.
And you here at the Brennan Center, you were one of the leaders of what we call our constitutional crisis litigation project, with capital letters to signify how grand it is. But what we are doing, among other things, is helping to organize and often writing these friend of the court briefs. We try to minimize the use of Latin, but they're the amicus briefs, which can often inform these debates, whether it's government experts, historians, business leaders, or others. We did a brief, for example, on behalf of members of Congress about some of these issues several months ago. But do you think that these kinds of briefs are important, and do they tell a kind of an overall story?
Yes, I think they are absolutely important. And I think one of the stories that they tell overall is actually one of the few positives to come out of this situation, a silver lining, if you will. And that is that we have seen a remarkable coalescing of voices from across the political spectrum, people who don't usually agree on policy, but who agree on the rule of law, who have come together in these cases to say that no matter what you believe from a policy perspective, this is not how the executive branch is supposed to be acting. So we've seen briefs from former executive branch attorneys from multiple administrations, conservative and progressive, come together, for example. We have seen conservative thinkers agree with progressive legal academics who otherwise wouldn't agree. And so that is something that's very powerful and creates a signal to the court that says, look at all of these voices all coalescing around this one point. This is something you have to pay attention to if you want to keep any credibility.
And it signals this is not normal. This is a big constitutional question. And the justices themselves have a long paper trail themselves of saying, oh, the major questions doctrine, big questions need to be answered by Congress, not by the executive branch, and so on. And one of the questions that we have. Does that just apply to Joe Biden, or is that something that applies to all presidents, including Donald Trump? Shalanda, I want to ask you, as you look at what's going on, what do you see happening with the way the government should be helping people and is not helping people?
Look, I have a hard time thinking about the thing I told you don't forget, because it's hard not to get emotional when you think about this. You think about foreign aid. For example, there's been some good reporting, especially about NPR, following, literally a clinic closing because they've lost access to USAID funding. A child may go into a critical situation with sickle cell disease, and you can draw a pretty straight line to the lack of access to that doctor who has treated them in crisis before, that has resulted in their passing. All Americans should have a problem with that. I was always taught this country, how blessed we have been and we are, that part of our duty and out of that is we help others. So it's hard to see, the stories of actual human beings, children, being harmed by these funding decisions. You see it in this country right now. We're in the middle of a government, what we call a shutdown. The real term I like to use, the lapse of appropriation. The whole government isn't shut down. It's about a third of the government. Is whether or not people who use Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, SNAP, will get their November assistance. Now, we have never failed to meet our obligation under SNAP. And this administration is choosing not to use a contingency fund, which was set up exactly for this purpose, to help fill the gap during a government shutdown or lapse in appropriation. So they are contending today that come November 1st, the 42 million Americans who use SNAP will not get that benefit in November. I think it's cruel. I think it goes against everything we've ever done to manage that program in instances like this. This is not the first shutdown we've ever been in. And the contingency fund was set up just for this. So the thing we talked about before when I visited Brennan Center, unfortunately, is right in front of us. And the states are suing because they believe it is unlawful for the administration not to use this contingency fund. And as a matter of fact, Michael, not just contingency fund, they have a way to make up all the funding. They can transfer money from Section 32, which is how they help deal with the Women and Children's Nutrition Program. They just did it for another program. So we have a way to close the entire gap and make sure no one misses out on any food benefit for this next payment. And it's just ugly and it's cruel that they're not using every tool at their disposal. As a matter of fact, their own shutdown plan that was on their website on USDA said they would use the contingency fund when it came to it, and they took it down.
It's a deliberate effort to inflict pain on the American people, maybe to make a point, maybe because it follows a deeper animus.
And I think it's a critical misunderstanding of how government works. There, you continue to hear, I'm going to do this for red America, not blue America. I come from the deep South. I come from South Louisiana. You can't throw a rock without hitting a Democrat and a Republican. This idea that you can parse through people who need certain programs and not others is a complete misunderstanding of who the government helps and how government programs go out. So yeah, I do think it's intended to harm certain groups who they think maybe only vote for Democrats or who Democrats care about. The government helps people regardless of political affiliation. I know that's not what some people want you to believe, but that's actually the truth. On energy projects, care about clean energy? Joe Biden put a lot of that new infrastructure in so-called red states like Georgia. You get elected to these jobs, I get through a partisan process, but what I found in my years of government service is you cannot separate Americans like this and think you can target certain groups, which is hateful in itself, but it's also impossible to do. Hunger hits red and blue America the same, and it does not matter who you voted for. And I hope they come to that conclusion and get to know government and how it works fast before we really do some harm by withholding funding for this program.
Well, I think that sometimes one gets the sense that they're operating from almost a 1980s a stereotype of, oh, these are takers. You know, this is a narrow sliver of the society and they're takers. Whether it's SNAP, food assistance, or Medicaid, these are American programs used very widely across the country by very hardworking people. They're deeply embedded in people's lives and expectations, in the finances of state governments and local governments. And I think one thing we may learn is that these programs are actually a lot more popular and have a much more visceral impact than perhaps people are expecting. You were part of negotiations that averted a default on the debt and shutdowns, but there have been other partial government shutdowns over the years. When I was working in the White House under Bill Clinton, there was one in 1995 and 1996, and at the time it seemed like a very big deal, and there was a real effort made, even as there were fights over what budget to sign, to try to ameliorate the damage, to try to cushion people from the impact, even though there was ultimately no way to fully cushion it, and we wanted to draw attention to the bad things that were happening. Do you get the sense that this administration has just tossed away that mission of trying to ameliorate it and take it seriously?
This is all new to politics that any of us have studied. The fact that an American president has been out of the country at least twice during a government shutdown is unheard to me. That used to be something, as of recently with the last president, where if you had a fiscal crisis at home, you stayed at home, you dealt with it. I remember being in the middle of that debt ceiling fight, making sure we did not default on our debt. And the president had to, at great disappointment, cancel his stops after the G20 in Australia and one other Pacific island location. And if you've ever seen those trips put together, there is a lot of commitment, and those host countries are very excited. It is a big deal for the president not to be able to do that. But every other president, but this one, has also felt it would be politically terrible to be out of the country dealing with foreign affairs while having your domestic affairs be blowing up and possibly defaulting or the government shut down. And so I've never seen anything like this. The lack of actual negotiations, the fact that, the House of Representatives, that Speaker Johnson has kept them home for over a month. This is stuff you're like, tell me how you think about it. I've never. This is a different beast than I've ever seen, and I think it's wrong. I don't think most Americans look at Congress and go, you know what I think they should do? I think they should talk less. Again, there's getting elected. That's always been a partisan exercise, and then there's governing. And some people govern real well, and some people run for election real well. And I hope those who are in charge now, the Republicans in Congress, and the American people gave them all levels of government. They've got to govern now. That means making sure people don't miss SNAP payments. That means sitting down with Democrats and finding a way out of this. It does not mean just talking on television and saying my way or the highway. And by the way, people forget this. We're shut down over a 7-week bill. This isn't even the long-term solution of how to fund government for the year. They've got to talk regardless. So this idea, I'm not going to negotiate until you reopen the government for what, 2 more weeks? Where are the conversations and negotiations about how you fund the government long term? We can't even agree on 7 weeks. So I think most Americans want people to sit down and get serious and do their jobs. I don't think politics have changed that much, and I think it's a miscalculation. And I hope people realize that sooner rather than later, because people are hurting. And we're here talking about SNAP and other things as we have a government shutdown, as we might have more government workers who actually need these programs, because people live paycheck to paycheck who work for our government. I remember being in policy conversations trying to figure out how to make sure troops don't need SNAP, because our research showed us there were troops on SNAP, which is, is awful for a country, and we need to make sure that we fix that. But if that's the case, if the economy is getting worse for some people, why now will we also turn off a program that provides necessary food aid? So, all these conversations come around to each other. Tariffs, cost of living, and this is, to me, does not seem the time to have less with regard to food assistance, less with regard to health care.
Very thing for Speaker Mike Johnson to have kept the House out of session for this long. This is like a state legislature that meets every 6 months, or back when people had to ride horses to get to Congress. It is a giving up of its role and of power that is really something I can't think of in the modern period. And it will be hard to get the toothpaste back into the tube. It really could shift a lot of presumptions. If you were giving advice to the Democrats in this, do you think that they have handled this well? Do you think the demands they are making are the ones they should have been making? There's a debate that we've seen of, obviously, the Medicaid premiums, and the healthcare issue is very important to people, to the cost of living, which people care about a lot. At the same time, they chose not to bring in other issues, the domestic use of troops, or ICE, or other things of that nature. Do you think that they have played whatever their cards are well? And how do you see this all ending?
Here's the thing. I tell people the Republican knock on Democrats since I've been alive is they love government. So this is painful for Democrats, just painful. The party I work for believes that a well-run government with the right amount of assistance targeted to the right people who try to help people who are working get a little breathing room and a leg up. It's never been perfect, but a goal to make a government work better for the American people. That's kind of the party brand. So I tell people, raise your hand if you really believe Democrats are okay with a shutdown. They're not. That should tell you they feel we're left with no choice. And I go back to what feels very different in this. Like, every party always has like public demands, but you get to a negotiating table and you have the conversation you have that might have more on the table. Some of the things you're talking about, we are talking about spending, so it's hard not to talk about impoundment and rescissions. But that doesn't mean that's what you talk about when you go out and talk about it publicly. So I understand why they would simplify the public messaging around premium tax credits and health care. You could also talk about Medicaid. We just had a budget bill this summer that cut Medicaid that Democrats talked about. But so I get it. There's always a need to streamline what you say publicly, because it is a lot. This administration has perfected shock and awe. It is hard for people who are trying to feed their kids every day to keep up with like every impoundment, every deployment of the National Guard, every tariff. I mean, we wake up in the morning and I try to decide whether I can order a new sink or not, and whether I'm going to pay like 40% more if we're mad at Canada. Most people cannot keep track of all of that. So I get the simplification for message purposes, but there's always a negotiating table, or at least till now, where, the litany of things that need to be dealt with come up. So I have every hope that Republicans will find their way to a negotiating table. You can't ask people to vote for something that does not align with their values. Kevin McCarthy told me that. He told the president that. The president said, why should I negotiate? Your job is to raise the debt limit. That's Congress's job. Are you really saying you're not going to do that? And Kevin McCarthy said, you got to talk to me. You want my members' votes? You have to talk to me. I think Democrats are saying the same thing.
What's left of the news media, it's going to be a real duty for them when these cuts really take effect, for example, on November 1st and these other things, to really tell the story of what's going on, to try to break through the din, because there's so many things happening at once.
It's so many.
These are
so
real
many
people.
things.
Again, we have a number of questions from those who are tuning in, and it relates in the sense to the legal implications of what we've just been talking about, of the political fight and of the pain. And Lauren, what people have been asking, several people, is how do we see the shutdown potentially affecting either the vibe or the actual rulings on these spending issues in the courts? I will note that the federal courts are not immune from this. In the last few days, they've started furloughing people, they haven't furloughed, they've stopped paying people. They're still working. But there's going to start to be rumblings of discontent from people in robes as well.
Of course. I think what we're going to see with the shutdown is, first of all, in terms of it ending, you have this problem related to what the administration has been doing for the past 10 months as well, which is that it hasn't been following the laws that Congress has been enacting. So when it comes to ending a shutdown, normally you have this incentive to negotiate and compromise and ultimately pass something at the end of it. But that incentive doesn't exist anymore when there's no assumption that the president is going to actually follow what Congress enacts. So it is going to be difficult to end this shutdown. And what we've seen as part of the shutdown as well is that the president has used it as further ammunition to do the things that he's already been doing with funding. To your point, we have seen him withhold money from Democratic-led jurisdictions to punish them and coerce them into following his policy preferences. We have seen countless federal employees laid off and massive reductions in force that courts have already stepped in to temporarily pause. So in addition to the courts being very discontented if they too are not getting paid and their staff not getting paid, we're going to see even more and more litigation flooding the courts related to the shutdown.
But we should not be expecting the Supreme Court to make some ruling that's going to end or resolve the shutdown. But there will be these other cases. And again, this is an area where a lot of these very highfalutin sounding legal concepts, the major questions doctrine, which was first articulated in the West Virginia versus EPA case just a few years ago, saying really big decisions have to be made by Congress, not the executive branch, whether they were right in applying it to that climate change regulation. But so many of these funding issues, emphatically, whether to shut down USAID, that's exactly the kind of thing the Constitution assumes and contemplates and insists that Congress will do. The unitary executive theory is the claim that the Constitution gives the president personal control over the entire executive branch, and that therefore Congress can't pass laws to regulate what goes on within the executive branch. In its most extreme form, it's sort of the notion that everybody who works for the president does so as though they were a gardener at Mar-a-Lago, that it's that direct. That plays out in these fights, and the Supreme Court again has been very pro-presidential power. A lot of the justices have been pushing this stuff, but they also hindered Joe Biden when he tried to do many of these things. And one of the big tests is going to be whether they're being partisan or not. Do you think that they will be bound by their past statements on these things?
You would hope that they are, but what we've seen in recent years is that the court has certainly been willing to overturn themselves if the opportunity arises. And so What I think we will have to confront if the court suddenly starts contradicting themselves is a lot of these big questions of the framers assumed when they created our constitutional system that the members of their different branches would identify as members of those branches and protect their prerogatives accordingly. So what do we do when those members of those branches are no longer doing so? And that leads us into things like Supreme Court reform, for example, long term down the road. Leads us into thinking, what can Congress do if we can elect members of Congress that want to claim their constitutional role to limit the president in the future, if it can statutorily, make it even more possible for him to wiggle out of different statutes. So we're going to have to start thinking about how we can rectify this going forward.
This is, Shalanda, one of these moments where big constitutional questions are called for us to think about and act on. And it is important, I think, for Democrats, for progressives, for liberals to remember that it's not entirely the case that you don't want presidents to have any control over the executive branch. I am guessing that in your role as OMB director, there are aspects of the unitary executive theory that you think actually help government. In other words, OMB has considerable control over the regulatory agencies through the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, OIRA, and other things. It's a big, sprawling operation, the federal government. And if a president gets elected and is going to try to actually implement the policies that the president ran on, you actually want to be able to have some control over the executive branch and not be entirely hindered in that. Am I right in that notion that, it's not all one or the other?
You're absolutely right. Can you imagine getting elected president and you still can't get your agenda done because there are some norms about how you interact with certain agencies. Now, presidents do get to nominate and confirm. They always have the heads of those agencies. So the idea is a president surely picks someone whose vision is aligned with his or hers. So that is a major, and there's often coordination. But yeah, if you have an OIRA like Joe Biden did, and I believe we helped agencies write regulations that were, that spoke to how Joe Biden told the American people he wanted to govern. And OIRA wasn't making decisions separate from the White House. It was to ensure that the government was speaking with a one voice as much as possible. So with an OIRA that is run in that way, you can imagine it makes sense for, as many regulations as possible, the major ones, to ensure that they go through this interagency process and make sure we are speaking with one voice as a government. That's the benefit of OIRA with regulations. It makes sure that everyone who can have any part of an issue gets to have some say in this critical interagency process. That, we did that for regulations through OIRA. We did that for executive orders. OMB also does that that interagency review. And now we see executive orders. There's no way that has gone through some kind of review process. So in some ways, this administration is saying, yes, independent agencies, send me your stuff. And you just have to imagine is to make sure they don't do things, that might be different from where the White House believes. But on the other, where, you want a process to play out when you're doing executive orders, you can't do 200 of them in 9 months and think there's much of a process. But you're right, being at OMB, helping to run the government, there is flexibility. Any president needs to answer major policy issues that come up, given that a lot of these funding bills don't get enacted until maybe 2 years after funding is recommended by the president to Congress. Infant formula comes to mind. We had a shortage that no one saw coming. We had, a problem at one plant, and it led to parents My child was at the tail end of needing formula. Can you imagine like walking into a store and imagine being a parent of a kid who could only use like very specialized formula. um, Congress didn't like know this problem was coming, but it had given us enough flexibility. And if they hadn't, we would have had to go back to them and ask them. But we were able to work with our European partners and find funding that was flexible enough. So yeah, there's absolutely a need to build in flexibility. But the problem is, the more the executive branch abuses it, the more the reaction from Congress is going to be to take that flexibility away. So they're actually doing more harm for presidents in the future. If Congress ever gets its act together, the response will be to restrict that level of flexibility. Then how do you manage things like infant formula? How do you manage an outbreak of tuberculosis in a country, and we have to move foreign aid around? So they're not, they're doing things that benefit their vision of America, but they're doing a disservice to future administrations, which who could lose this flexibility if Congress again ever gets its act together. The response would be, given how much of an overreach they've seen, is to take some of that power back, or a lot of it.
That's really interesting. And, we hear about the abundance argument, the idea that government needs to be able to do stuff and needs to be able to do climate change funding or other kinds of things that takes so long to get done. And under your leadership, OMB played an unusual role in actually working with the agencies to actually get them to do the things they were supposed to do faster in many instances, to actually fulfill the purposes of the laws. And as opposed to not only being a kind of a foot on the brake, but actually encouraging the agencies to actually act. And I think that's a really important, for those of us who want government to have the public's trust. I think that's really quite important. Last question for both of you. What can we do? What can people who are listening to us do about this? What should they be saying to elected officials and others about what they want at this moment on this issue of the spending and the flow of funds?
The one thing people should not do is disengage. I believe this moment and this overwhelming push is meant to demoralize and have people separate from the process, and think this is just too great and I can't stand up to it. Please don't disengage. And people have a lot going on in life, but this is worth your time. It is literally how our country will function, and who in this country government is supposed to look out for. So I'm very clear when people ask me, what can I do? Stay engaged. Stay engaged. If you're not engaged, get your uncle, your aunt engaged. Like, ask them, you think this right? Usually the answer is no. If you tell them in plain language, hey, this is going on, you think this is right? I don't. Like, engage people. Don't turn off the television. It's easy to do that when it's all encompassing. So I try to, when I talk to students who want to go in government, you still have those, and they just, they don't know what to do, where to turn next. Try local government, try state government. There are ways to get involved. The governors are, taking people who would normally go to the federal government. They're doing great things on the ground. Don't disengage from your government. It's yours, is not anybody else's, and don't let anyone else tell you that. And this is a point of time. We have had hard times in this country before, where we have felt very far apart from each other. And because we have had those, I know we can get through those. And it's a little Pollyannish, but that's the whole point of history. And even now, people want to take our history away from us. Well, we need it now more than ever, because if we saw a way out of some of those times, it gives us a roadmap to find our way out of this.
Here, here. It is hard to it is hard to top that. Lauren, what would you say to people?
I couldn't agree more. And I think what's important for people to remember when they are engaging on this issue, it's very easy for your eyes to gloss over when you hear some of these funding terms or think that federal spending is divorced from your everyday reality. But the instant that you walk out the door every morning, federal funding impacts you. It's the roads you go to work on, the public transportation you take, the school lunches your child might receive, education services they might get, critical health care and Medicaid and breakthrough medical treatments you might receive that are all impacted by federal funding. So people can take this information and engage with their community. They can and they have to engage with their member of Congress to encourage them to reclaim this congressional role of the power of the purse. And most importantly, above all, if they are passionate about this issue, they have to vote in the midterms when it comes to congressional elections next year.
Thank you so much. Thank you to everybody. This podcast, The Briefing, is a new initiative for us at the Brennan Center. We think it's a really useful way to go a little more in depth on some of these issues. We would be grateful if you would share this with your friends and your circles, to subscribe, to make sure people know that they can find this on YouTube, on all the platforms and streaming platforms where podcasts are found. Thank you again to Lauren Miller Karalunas and to Shalanda Young, the esteemed former director of the Office of Management and Budget. And thank you to all of you. I'm Michael Waldman.